Hello, this is the first video on workflow management in Cobblestone Contract Insight. This video is going to serve as an overview of workflow and walk through a demonstration of how workflow looks day to day on a contract. Then, in the following videos, we're going to talk about how to add and manage workflow steps. So let's start off with a definition. What is workflow? So essentially, workflow is Cobblestone's conditional alert engine. When pre-established conditions are met, and these conditions can be field conditions and time conditions, it will trigger a workflow. Okay. Now, these workflow alerts are usually going to be used for one of two things. The first is a task, and a workflow task is more or less a job that you have to do in the system, right? You receive a task, it could be a legal review, finance review, send something for signature, whatever. You have to do whatever that job entails, and then physically click a button, approve or reject commonly. Okay, so that's a task. Now we often string these tasks together to form like a workflow approval process, right? So when you complete task one, it triggers task two, and you complete task two, and it triggers task three. And when we talk about workflow day to day, this is what most folks think of, right? Workflow approval task. If you just say workflow, most people will assume you're talking about an approval process of some sort. And that's generally true. It's a safe assumption. And these workflow approval processes can be very simple or very complex. It really just depends on what you're looking to do. But you should know that they are very flexible and highly conditional if you need them to be. Second, workflow can be used for notifications effectively. Technically speaking, they're auto-completing tasks, but if you just think of them as notifications, I think that's all the better. So we could set up one-off notifications to remind you of upcoming expirations or renewals, maybe notify you when something has been signed or uploaded, something like that. And when I mean by notification, I mean very colloquially, it's like you're being emailed about something, just to let you know something has happened. But no action is necessary per se. Okay, so we have like tasks, which are jobs you have to do, and then notifications, which is just alerting you of things happening in the system. Workflow can also control some other things in the system, like auto updating fields and things of that like, but that's a conversation for another time. Those are a bit more nuanced. Now, as a heads up, workflow is one of the more complex areas of the system that we manage day to day. Just by its nature, there are inputs and outputs and a lot of conditions. So there's a lot of moving parts for workflow. It's not that the user interface is especially complicated. It's really just the logic of workflow that can be intimidating for some folks who aren't necessarily used to dealing with conditional logic. Okay, but once you get used to it, workflow is really fairly straightforward, especially sort of linear processes aren't really all that complicated. In the upcoming series, we're mostly going to focus on how to build like one workflow step and talk about that, and then how to link one step to another step. So when you complete step one, it triggers steps two. And then most of configuring workflow from there is just following that same logic. If you can build one step and then have that one step trigger the second step, you could build almost any step that you'd like, right? So that's what we'll be focusing on, really just building one step in these future videos. Now, I hope that makes sense in explaining what workflow is. Now let's walk through an example. So looking at my system here, let me first acknowledge that we can use workflow in any of the major areas of the system. So contracts, requests, counterparty records, employee records, so on and so forth. But the most common area that we use workflow is contracts. So when you add a new contract to the system, it triggers an approval process, right? Then workflow doesn't only have to be used when you add a new thing to the system. You can most definitely have workflow trigger at any point on the record's lifecycle. So let's say something is coming up for renewal. It might trigger a workflow, say 90 days prior to the renewal process to get it approved for renewal. Maybe you add an amendment and that amendment must be approved. So again, those are great cases for post-execution workflow processes, but again, for this example, we're going to stick to the basics, which is an approval process when you add a new contract to the system. So I'll just add a contract record, and in this case, I'm going to choose a consulting agreement as an example. Now, as I mentioned, workflow are condition-based processes. And for now, I just want you to focus on the field conditions. Now, there's one very, very, very common field condition that almost every organization uses for their workflow conditions, and that's the status field. Okay, so when the status equals pending, in my case, that is going to trigger the condition. We usually have a status in this drop-down list that corresponds with each step of the workflow approval process. Okay, so this will eventually change to legal review and finance review and counterparty review and so on and so forth. But status is almost always going to be one of the conditions for your workflow, at least for approval processes. Now, if you have a very simple process, you might just have status as your condition. But there are some other common fields that are used as conditions. First is the contract type. So let's say it's a consulting agreement, and okay, you have a specific process to approve a consulting agreement. Maybe it's an NDA. We could have a different process for an NDA. So next we have our department field, or maybe our location field. It can sort of work the same way, but basically if we're in a different department or a different location, we might loop in different people for approval. So if we're in the administration department, as we are here, it might loop in the manager from that department. While we're in the customer service department, okay, it might loop in the manager from that department. So having differences in the department or location or entity is very common. And then the last common condition I want to acknowledge is the contract amount. So some common examples here might be if the contract is between $0 and say $10,000, it might go to a standard finance review. If it's between $10,001 and say $50,000, it might go to the finance manager. And if it's above $50,000, maybe it goes to the CEO or a VP or someone like that. Right? So we can have different tiers and different escalations based on the contract amount. And these are by no means the only conditions that you can use for your workflow. Any of your fields on your contract here can be used as workflow conditions. These are just common conditions from out-of-the-box fields. For this workflow that we're using in this video and the following videos, the conditions are simply that the contract type equals consulting agreement and that the status equals pending. Okay, so this is specifically an approval process for consulting agreements. In my case, you could most definitely have different fields if you want to. Now, to make things easy, I'm going to just fill out the rest of this contract add screen and then click save at the bottom. And then we're going to fast forward into the contract detail screen after I add the contract. So now we've added our contract to the system. First are these notices and alerts. You may or may not have these configured to show up at the top of your page, but either way, what this is doing is it's letting me know I have one open task on the record. This is automatically going to pop up because I have a new workflow task. And this is a special one that I configured that's called an on-screen alert. This one happens to say new task, please complete task below, but I told it to say that. You can configure these however you'd like. These are also configured through workflow. Okay, so this one's a bit more automatic and static. This one is configurable, and I told it to say this. Both set up through workflow. This one says document authoring template, successfully merge template consulting agreement onto record. And real quick, if I jump over to attachments and templates, I'm going to see some files automatically attached to the files and attachments table. There's no movie magic here or anything like that. No editing. This actually just appeared here. You can see it says on the notes, auto attached from workflow. So essentially what happened is we can tell workflow to auto merge certain templates and attach them. Right. So if you are generating your agreements from templates, we can have that automated through workflow. If you aren't automating this through workflow, you'd have to go down, click merge standard template, choose the template, attach it, so on and so forth. But in this sense, you could just automate that process. We're going to cover how to do that later on. And if you're not familiar with what document templates are, absolutely check out those other videos in the Unit 3 playlist. Okay, now all of these things aside, these are configured through workflow and are important to workflow, but they are a bit tangential. So back into the matter at hand, I want to jump over to the tasks and emails tab, where of course we're going to manage our tasks and workflow. We're going to look at this tasks and workflow subtable here. This is really where the magic happens. And let me just acknowledge that this is called prepare for review, right? It's sent to Tyler Holzer in this case, as a start date and end date, and we're going to see that it's currently open. Now, when you receive a workflow task, you receive an email that looks something like this on the right-hand side of my screen. It has task information about the contract, approve and reject buttons, and there are links at the bottom that didn't really fit in the screenshot here that take you back to the record. So you should expect to receive emails when you have new workflow items assigned to you. So you're going to be notified outside of the system when it's your turn to do something relating to workflow. Inside the system, there's also a bell icon at the top that will sort of tick up when you have a new workflow assigned to you. And then I always recommend setting up a dashboard to show you when you have pending tasks or overdue tasks and things of the like. That dashboard setup doesn't really come out of the box per se, but it is really nice to set up. Okay, and if you're curious about how to set up that, check out the Unit 2 videos on reports and dashboards. At any rate, we have a new task. Okay, so we're going to want to check out how to complete this task. This information is in the email, but if you're in the system, you can click View. That takes you to some more information about the task, and you want to look under the Details field. It says, please attach supporting documents and draft a new contract. So we'll go do that, right? We're not really going to do that in this video, but you're going to do whatever the task entails, right? If that's a legal review or finance review or sign up for signature, whatever. So go do that task. When you're ready to complete that, go to task action, okay? And then click approve or reject probably. In this case, we're going to take the happy path and click approve, click OK. And when we do that, two things are going to happen. In this case, and in most cases for approval processes. The first thing that happens is the status changes to legal review. Okay, so the status has automatically changed. This is what we call a field update. And then if I jump on over to tasks and emails again, now we have the next task. That's the second thing that happened. So the status changes and the next task will trigger. Legal review, this one's assigned to Theodore Roosevelt, and you can see the previous task is now completed. And it really works the same way. You could approve this task. You know, we would do the legal review, approve the task, and then it moves on, so on and so forth. Okay. And we do have these two other buttons here under this drop-down list, reject and needs more info. Let's talk about those. So first, approve and reject are the two out-of-the-box options you'll interact with. It's like the binary yes, no. And what's reject do? To be honest, it's really up to you. There's no hard-coded functionality for what reject would do. So what happens when you click approve? Well, it's up to you, right? What do you want to happen after a counterparty review or after a legal review? It's whatever you want to configure. On yes, right? And reject, no, really works the same way. Whatever you want to happen can. Most commonly, it will escalate this to like a manager or someone else. It might loop in the contract owner, or it might go backwards. So maybe if this was rejected, it goes back to the legal review. That's pretty common too. So usually it goes like up or back, but it doesn't have to. And then we have needs more info. Needs more info does not come out of the box. I configured this for my system. And you can configure other buttons, as I'm illustrating here. So in addition to just yes and no, you might need other options for more complexity in your workflow processes. So instead of just going down like path A or path B, now we have a path C. So some organizations need this for more complex processes. And we are going to talk about how to configure these in a later video. These are called task statuses. Okay, so check out that video if you're curious about this. And much like approve and reject, what's this do? Up to you. What would happen if you click needs more info? Well, whatever you configure to happen. Usually, though, if you click this, it would trigger a status change, and that status change would trigger the next workflow step, whatever that may be. Okay, so this is generally how workflow will operate day to day. You receive a task, you do that job, you complete the task, and it triggers the next task, and so on and so forth. To be clear, we could have simultaneous tasks, right? So multiple approvals happening at the same time. Sometimes you need multiple things to be approved before the next task begins. Sometimes the completion of one task might trigger multiple tasks. So these don't always have to be a one-to-one process, although that's very common. You don't have to do that. So I hope this has been helpful as a workflow overview. Check out the next videos where we're going to talk about workflow setup and configuration. Thank you.